Ghosts Germany is finally out, and this might even be my favourite version of the show so far. It is available to watch online at Ard Mediatek's site. I will link it below. It is available from the UK. It is not available with English subtitles. So, my German is iffy. I've studied German twice. I did quite well at it in school, but stopped at age 16. I studied it a bit at uni, but it was mostly German for academic reading, and it's very rusty. But my German is not non-existent, and I have been able to watch it, and I think I followed most of what was going on. There are a few places I might not be sure, and obviously anything I get wrong, let me know in the comments, but I'm pretty sure I followed it pretty decently, and it's very similar to the British one in a lot of places anyway. It is also going to be broadcasting on the channel 1 from the 13th of March. In this video, I'm just going to go through some of the main similarities and differences between this version and the British and, by extension, American versions, and give some of my initial thoughts on the series. There will be spoilers for all 6 episodes in this video, so proceed with caution if you haven't seen the show yet. And yes, there are differences between this one and the British one, and of course, between this one and the American one as well. So yes, there are things you might be spoiled on if you watch this and you haven't seen the show yet. If you're new here, hi, I'm Juliet. I'm a writer and historian, and on this channel I cover myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. And I absolutely love all versions of this sitcom, so let's get to it! The basic setup for all versions of Ghosts, for anyone who is unfamiliar, is that a young woman inherits a very large house, mansion, or castle from a distant relative who has just died, and she moves in with her partner. Not long after they move in, something happens and she nearly dies. It varies in each version, and when she wakes up from a brief coma, she finds herself able to see ghosts. She can see dead people, as I'm pretty sure they put it in every version. Her long-suffering partner cannot see the ghosts, but they do demonstrate their existence to him pretty early on. One of the ghosts is able to manipulate things, push things over and press buttons, so he knows what's going on, but of course they don't tell very many other people, if anyone. The large old house the young woman has inherited is inhabited by a large number of ghosts because anybody who dies on the property ends up haunting it. This is very common in ghost folklore and has been seen in TV series including American Horror Story Murder House and The Haunting of Hill House. That's the Mike Flanagan Netflix version, not the actual original Haunting of Hill House, which is quite different. I was also very pleased to realise that I did get some of the jokes in German. Asterix and Obelix have made their way into Britain in English translations as well. That's a French cartoon series. There are also some films. There were several starring Gérard Depardieu. There's also a more recent one that was written and directed by the actor who played the French lieutenant in Joyeux Noël, which is one of my favourite films. So when Emma, the living woman who can see ghosts, calls the Roman soldier Asterix et Obelix, Asterix und Obelix, I knew what she meant. I know that Aschenputtel is a reference to Cinderella when she is talking to Griet, who smokes like Mary in the British one. And I know that Zombie Goethe is a reference to the famous 19th century German poet. The setting for this version of the story is a very classically European, you see a lot of them in Germany and France, kind of castle slash palace slash house mansion. You don't get as many of this type of building in Britain. In Britain, people tended to go for full-on fortified castles designed to withstand a siege in the medieval period, and then when the British switched to building houses around the 16th century, they switched to quite a different style. That classic Tudor house, a lot more glass in the windows, and much more of a kind of house look to it. In France and Germany and Scandinavia and other parts of Europe, there was more of a fashion for a bit of a hybrid. It's often referred to as a castle, a Schloss in Germany, a chateau in France. And by the way, this is filmed in Cologne. I actually recognised Cologne from a wide shot of the city that had the cathedral in it. I was there for a conference several years ago now, and it's an absolutely beautiful city. If you ever get the chance to visit Köln or Cologne, definitely do. Lovely place to go and see. So this type of castle slash palace slash mansion is very characteristic of this area of Europe. The production values on this show are great. There's some lovely, really creepy shots, as well as it just looks really good in general. I like the living couple very much. I like the living couples in all the versions of this series, but I did find Emma and Felix very likeable, a lot of fun to watch. Interestingly, they are not yet married. The British and American versions, both of our living couples, which is Alison and Mike in the British version, and Sam and Jay in the American version, they are already married at the beginning of the series. That is not the case for Emma and Felix, and that actually becomes a plot point as Series 1 goes on, which is really nice. It's almost a bit of a missed opportunity in the others that they're already married, and so the shows never had the opportunity to do storylines around them getting engaged or getting married or anything like that. So it's quite nice to see an entire plot around Felix trying to propose to Emma, and of course the ghosts and hauntings getting in the way. We also see Felix and Emma trying to get an apartment at the beginning, which is a process that's clearly very different to anything that happens in the UK. This is to do with housing in Germany. They're trying to apply for an apartment and they're really struggling to find somewhere to live, so it obviously saves their bacon when Emma suddenly inherits this palace. Generally speaking, this is much more similar to the British version than the American version. That's not surprising, it's a co-production with the BBC, and of course British and German history are also much more similar than the history of either country and the history of America. I'm still disappointed that the British version of the show didn't have a Roman ghost in it, because they could have done. In Britain, the German one does, but essentially there's a lot more similarities and points in common across the history of the two countries than there are with America, which has a very different history. And the first 2 episodes of this series are essentially remakes of the first 2 episodes of the British version. There are, of course, various differences, but they are basically remakes of the first 2 episodes of the British show. They do take a third approach to the accident that allows Emma to see ghosts, though. In the British version, rather shockingly, one of the ghosts, Julian, actually tries to murder Alison. He literally shoves her out of the window. And this was eventually addressed right at the end of the British series, because it's quite alarming when you think about it. And most of the show is this really lovely, we are all each other's family vibe. And the fact that Julian outright tries to murder Alison at the beginning is really quite strange. In the American version, Trevor had thought about trying to murder Sam, but he's not actually trying to murder her at the point that she has her accident. He is trying to push over a vase. He finally succeeds, and she comes along at right that moment and falls down the stairs. We see here yet another option, and in fact it's a different ghost. It's Urs the caveman who accidentally nearly kills Emma in this version, and he nearly electrocutes her. But I think, and forgive me if my rusty German is leading me astray, but I'm pretty sure it is an accident. Urs is a caveman who doesn't even know what a hotel is. So he has the same ghost power as his counterpart Robin in the British version. He can affect electrical lights. Presumably he has also been killed by lightning. And he is trying to make the lights flicker, because this is the point in the story where the ghosts are trying to scare Emma into leaving the house. So they are haunting her, actively and deliberately haunting her in various ways. And Urs is trying to make the lights flicker wherever she is, but Emma is in the process of doing something with the electronics and she gets electrocuted. But I'm pretty sure he was just trying to scare her, not to kill her. So like the American version, the accident is an accident in this case. The German version of this story has the smallest group of core ghosts so far. There are only 7 regular ghosts. That matches the later seasons of the British one after Mary had left the show. She had been sucked off, as they put it in this series. The American show has a bigger cast of about 9 regular ghosts, and the American show also has a lot more recurring characters. There's a ghost living in the attic, there's a ghost living next door, there's ghosts who appear at various points, who come back and forth, pop up from hell and go back again. The American show, being American, has to fill a lot more episodes, and therefore tends to introduce a lot more secondary and recurring characters. The German show has by far the smallest cast. We also haven't met any kind of nosy next-door neighbour on the German show yet either. And we literally have just 7 core ghosts and 1 other, which is the little girl ghost. This ghost is absent from the American version, but is based on Jemima from the British version. The German version is called Lotti. And I love what they've done with this ghost. She is the only one outside the core group who appears at all. Like the British one, she's very creepy, but she has a different style to her. They've actually gone for a Japanese-inspired style where she looks a bit like the ghost from Ringu. She has very, very long, wet hair that dangles over her face, as well as looking much, much creepier than any of the other ghosts in the house. I suspect this is for a couple of reasons. One is that this show, like the British version, does include some moments that are creepy and even some jump scares. At one point, Lotti is hiding under the bed. Felix doesn't see her, but Joachim, one of the ghosts, he does, and it's a jump scare for both him and the audience. Every time they want to add in something a little bit creepy, a little bit actually horror-like, Lotti is there to do so. So they're drawing on Japanese horror and those tropes that audiences are familiar with to make that point. I think maybe the other reason is because her hair is hanging over her face. Presumably this will make her easier to recast, because the problem with a child ghost is the actress is inevitably going to grow up and age. The British show simply stopped featuring Jemima after series 2. The American one doesn't have any child ghosts in it, or certainly not any regular ones. But because Lotti has long hair hanging over her face and quite thick makeup, I think the German show could probably keep her around by simply recasting the part if they reach the point they need to. And conveniently enough, the castle, house, palace has a moat around it. Again, unlike either of the other two versions, so it makes sense that poor Lotti has clearly drowned in the moat, and that is why she has this long, wet hair dangling in front of her face look to her. She also sings an incredibly creepy nursery rhyme. The British Jemima did something similar, but German culture provides us with an even creepier rhyme than British culture does, and we have some pretty creepy nursery rhymes as well. I looked up the rhyme online that she sings. It is a rhyme called May Beetle Fly, in German Mai Käferflieg. It is apparently a well-known German folk and children's song that deals with a dire situation in wartime. There are a few different versions, but here's an English translation of one of the better-known ones. May beetle fly, father is at war, mother is in Pomerania, and Pomerania has burned down. Another version actually referred to England. Ladybug fly, your father is at war, your mother is in England, England has burned down. I can't remember off the top of my head which one she sang. I hadn't worked out how to turn on the German subtitles when I watched that episode, which makes it easier to find written things, but I did catch your father is at war as one of the lines. Although our group of core ghosts is smaller, they do cover the biggest span of time, or at least the same span of time as the British one, but spread more sort of evenly, not quite evenly, but spread more across that period of time. There is a conversation where they appear to give the length of time some of them have lived in the house, but honestly, this drove me absolutely nuts because it doesn't make sense. It can't possibly be right unless I've misunderstood something in the German, or maybe they are not talking about themselves but a different character. The ghosts are explaining to a new ghost how long they have been in the house. And it looks like Svenni says she has been there 20 years and Adelheid 200, but that doesn't make sense because even if Svenni is younger than her counterpart in the British American versions, Pat and Pete, she can't be any more recent than about the 1990s. There is a flashback to her death where the kids' clothes could be anything from kind of 70s, 80s, 90s. I think it looks 90s to me. Her outfit looks very 70s to me, but looking at the kids' clothes and kind of thinking about the time span, I can imagine that she could be from the 90s, or of course it might be the 80s. I think I just haven't caught enough of the German to follow exactly how long ago she died. But it's definitely not 20 years, because even the 90s is 30 years ago, and there is no way that scene was set in the noughties. And I'm pretty sure she's been there longer than Joachim, who is a counterpart to the US Trevor or the British Julian, who is usually the most recent ghost. Although, again, my German being iffy, Joachim is wearing the top half of a suit and nothing on the bottom, the same as Julian and Trevor, which does mean that he could be from really anywhere in the late 20th or early 21st centuries. But I'm wondering if Svenni was talking about Joachim there, and Adelheid cannot possibly have been there for 200 years. She is dressed in an outfit, a costume that is clearly either late 19th or early 20th century. That is definitely not early 19th century. We see the early 19th century in episode 3, correctly costumed with what would be English Regency period outfits, Napoleonic Wars period. So unless maybe she was talking about Friedrich, who is about 200 years old. I'm not quite sure if I followed it right. And then Claudius is 2,000 years and Urs 2 million years. But we do have only 3 20th century ghosts, which is Adelheid, Svenni and Joachim, unless Joachim is 21st century, and the others are spread out a bit more across prehistory, ancient history, and then to what we would call early modern in British history, but from different parts of it. So Griet will be from probably the 16th or 17th century, the period of the witch trials. And there were enormous numbers of people, men and women, but a lot of women, who were executed for witchcraft in Germany. It was actually the site of some of the worst of the witch trials in Europe in that period. Thousands of people lost their lives. Some were burned, some were hanged, some were executed by other means. So I am assuming that that is what happened to Griet, as she, like Mary in the British version, smokes. And if you walk through her, you smell smoke. So I'm assuming she has been burned for witchcraft some point around the 15th or 16th centuries. The ghost who is most similar to his British counterpart is the one who is more or less missing from the American version, which is Friedrich, who is very like Thomas. The American version has Cesarpis, who is a storyteller and has some similarities, but Cesarpis is not in love with Sam, and he is from an earlier time period, so it's less of a close parallel. But Friedrich is very, very similar to the British Thomas. His rival is Goethe, rather than the British poetic rival of Byron, which makes sense because he's German. And other than that, he's almost exactly the same. He is madly in love with Emma, and we see his backstory in episode 3 much earlier than we saw Thomas's backstory in the British version, which appeared in a much later series. But here it takes up episode 3 and is, as far as I can tell, identical to the British version. Again, as far as I can tell, Joachim is almost a direct counterpart of Julian, and Urs is almost a direct counterpart of Robin, the caveman. I wasn't sure if Joachim might be an accountant rather than a politician. Trevor in the American version is a stockbroker, and he's wearing a suit, which could be anything. It looked to me like he was helping Emma with the accounts at one point. So again, let me know if I've missed something in the German with my iffy language skills. I am wondering if he might be an accountant rather than a politician, but I may have just not quite caught that. There is no scout leader because since the closing down of the Hitler Youth, that has not been so popular in Germany, so Svenni is a teacher rather than a scout leader, and she is of course also a woman and not a man. Otherwise, she is a fairly close counterpart of Pat in the British version, and indeed Pete in the American version. Of course, the entire storyline about Pete or Pat's wife cheating on him, that's not there. We see Svenni's death, which is very, very similar to Pat or Pete. And similarly, her family like to visit. This is placed in a different episode, though, and it's only a very small kind of B or C plot of the episode. It's not the focus of the episode. She does have a grandson who amusingly has been named Svenni. I did catch that one. So she is quite similar. She also takes a similar role in often being the leader, even though other characters might think they're in charge, particularly Claudius or Adelheid. The person who is actually coming up with plans and ideas does tend to be Svenni, and that's very, very similar to especially Pat from the British one. Svenni is also quite friendly with Emma once or twice in a way that is much less creepy than Kitty and Alison. I'm afraid Kitty is not my favourite character from the British version. She is so childlike, it's just a bit weird. And the American version, Hetty is more almost motherly towards Sam, and Flower is just not with it enough to be reliably kind of friendly. So while all of the ghosts are friendly with Sam, none of them have that kind of female friendship comfort that I'm starting to see develop between Svenni and Emma, which is quite nice. There is no World War II captain for very obvious reasons. There is a moment in episode 6 where Felix and Emma are looking for a new place to live. This parallels a similar, almost identical scene in the British version, but where in the British version, Alison looked out of an upper story window and could see 2 airmen from World War II floating in the air where they had, I guess, died, waving at her. In this version, it's a bit more sinister because Emma walks into a house and a Nazi officer turns around and gives her a very imperious stare, and she just walks out immediately. So that's a nice nod to the World War II captain from the British version. And also, yes, of course, it is obvious why there is not a World War II captain in the German version. Instead, Claudius the Roman takes that role. We haven't seen as much of Claudius yet. We don't know, or at least my German has not revealed to me, if he is straight or bi or gay. He does specifically mention when there is a lesbian wedding in episode 5 that in the Roman period, nobody is that bothered. this is entirely true and accurate. The Romans and the ancient Greeks did have some prejudices and ideas about who should or should not be sleeping with who, but they were completely different to modern ideas. They were based primarily on status more than on gender, and also on exactly what you're doing with each other, which I'm not going to go into right now. But essentially, Claudius could be interested in men or women or both, and it wouldn't be such a big deal. He wouldn't be closeted the way Isaac in the American version and the captain in the British version both are when we meet them. And that is a really nice scene as well, where we see so many of the characters from different time periods who aren't remotely bothered by two women being together. It's actually only Adelheid who finds it shocking, which is a really nice reminder that the Western Victorian mindset is not the mindset of everywhere in history and every period in history. It's the mindset of particular places and times, and is not the automatic human state. Claudius is, I suspect, named for Robert Graves's famous novel and the BBC adaptation of it, I, Claudius. Possibly. I mean, in fairness, I don't know how well known that is in Germany. Somebody tell me in the comments, but that would be my guess. It's a relatively common Roman name anyway. He occasionally throws in bits of Latin, which is great because I can actually understand it better, especially because it's often well-known phrases like alia jacta est, which means the die is cast, and is what Julius Caesar supposedly said immediately before crossing the Rubicon River and therefore declaring war on Rome. He also makes jokes using Latin. I was quite proud of myself for even picking up on this, given that I was already struggling to follow the German. But at one point, instead of saying abdominal wound, and whatever that is in German, he says woundus abdomicus, which is neither Latin nor German nor English, as far as I know. But it was quite funny. Adelheid is very similar to her British counterpart, Fanny. She has the same cause of death as Fanny, which is different to Hetty's cause of death, which is entirely different. I'm not saying what it is because it's a bit of a spoiler if you haven't seen the American show yet. Adelheid and Fanny were both pushed out of a window, and actress Antje Vidra, I think I'm pronouncing that right, she does the same thing that Martha Howe Douglas does in the British version, which is both actresses constantly hold their face like this all the time. It must hurt them. That's painful. And it's a non-makeup based way of showing that their face is squashed. Because, of course, in Ghosts, you see how somebody has died, if it's something that's visible. So Friedrich has a bullet wound, Griet is smoky, Svenni has an arrow through her neck, and Adelheid and Fanny landed on their face after being pushed out of a window. But rather than having any kind of makeup to help them out, it's just the actresses doing this all the time that shows that. And I mean, props to both of them for doing it. I would not want to perform an entire role doing that all the time. And the last of the core seven is Griet. She appears to have the same cause of death as Mary from the British version, as I mentioned. She is, however, a different personality to Mary, and I have to confess I like Griet more too. Her personality is more similar to Nancy from the American version, who is one of the American cholera ghosts, but she does have some of Mary's superstitions. She's also just more intelligent, certainly than Mary, and even maybe a little bit more than Nancy. She seems a lot more kind of with it than either of them, but a lot closer to Nancy than to Mary. I also learned that having a lucky penny in your shoe for your wedding day is a German thing as well. It's a sixpence over here, but same tradition. As I mentioned, the first two episodes are very, very similar to the British original. Not quite the same, small changes, and of course the biggest change being the accident that nearly kills Emma and results in her being able to see ghosts. The third episode is where the German show diverts a little bit, but the third, fifth and sixth episodes are all largely remakes of British episodes but switched around a bit and changed up a bit. The third episode is Friedrich's backstory, which, as far as my German can tell, is identical to his counterpart Thomas's in the British version, right down to the letter he tries to get rid of and can't, because everything you were touching at the time you died becomes part of your ghost being and you can't get rid of it. Episode 5 is very similar to the British wedding episode, not quite the same, especially as our living couple are not yet married, although their storyline is very, very similar anyway. But it's more or less similar to the British version. It also involves somebody shooting a penny under the door, which reminded me of the movie Ghost, which I thought was a nice touch. Episode 6, again, is very closely based on the British Series 1 episode 6. It has the addition of Svenni's backstory, which had to be cut because that was the British episode 3 and was a completely different story because Pat's story revolved a lot around his marriage, and that's not the case with Svenni. And it has the addition of Felix trying to propose and quite a cliffhanger on the end. Can she still see the ghosts? I'm going to assume yes. But episode 4 is, as far as I can tell, a storyline original to the German version. It's actually quite similar to the most recent episode that aired on the American version, but that episode aired literally a few days ago, so I think that is just a coincidence. And they're not overly similar anyway, they just have one similar plot element, which is the idea of a new person dying on the property and producing a new ghost. The American version had actually done this already with the character of Carol, which is a whole other story not relevant to the German version because they do not have the character of Pete. But this does something very different with that idea, and we don't know where the American show is going with the most recent version of this idea because it only just happened as the cliffhanger at the end of the most recent episode. So the treatment of that idea in this episode is original to the German show, and I really enjoyed it. There were some brilliant scenes here where the poor guy dies, hasn't even realised he's died at first, Emma doesn't realise he's died, then the police are coming round and questioning her, and at one point they're trying to work out, because the new ghost, he's fallen out of a window as it turns out, but he doesn't remember, they don't know where his body is or how he died. Emma gets taken off for questioning by the police because this guy has gone missing and she's acting very strangely, and then poor Felix has to find a dead body that he knows is somewhere in his house, but he doesn't know where. And it's grim and macabre and hilarious. It's so good. This also features one of my favourite tropes from both of the other versions, which is a situation where the ghosts have to try and communicate with the living person who can't see or hear them. There was an episode of the British show where Alison had gone out, and then there's intruders, and the ghosts are desperately trying to communicate with Mike to tell him that. There's an episode of the American version where Sam gets locked in a safe, a kind of locked room down in the basement. She can't get out, and she is going to be in serious trouble if she's there for a long time, and they're trying to tell Jay where she is and to let her out. In this case, the ghosts are trying to tell Felix where to look for this dead body using the medium of emojis, and it was brilliant. I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it. It also had a very sweet, sad scene between the new ghost and Adelheid, who of course had also died from falling out of a window. And at the end, the bit where they all think that the new ghost has gone to heaven and they're really happy for him, only for it to turn out that he is tied not to the house, but to the skip he fell into when he fell and is now stuck in this skip for all eternity, was, a bit sad, but very funny. That episode really shows that the German show is willing to do its own storylines, to do its own things with this concept and go to places that are its idea, that are not coming directly from the British or the American version. And I think that's a really good sign for future series. I really hope this gets renewed. I really, really enjoyed it. There was a cliffhanger at the end. I need to know what happens. I mean, I sort of can guess, but I want to know anyway. And I'm betting that if this show gets renewed for more series, that they will do more and more of their own original storylines. There's also lots of the ghosts we don't know much about. We only really know backstories for Friedrich in detail, and in a bit less detail for Adelheid, and a bit less detail for Svenni. We don't know the backstories of Griet or Claudius or Urs. We can guess Urs because he's probably going to be pretty similar to Robin, his British counterpart, but Claudius is kind of a blank slate. He's clearly not going to have the same backstory as the World War II captain from the British version or as Isaac from the American version. It's not possible. He lives in such a different time period from either one of them. So it would be great to see an episode focusing on him. And we haven't seen much of Joachim yet either, to the point that with my shaky German, I'm not even sure if he's an accountant or a stockbroker or a politician, or even a businessman. Please do tell me in the comments, because I'm sure he mentioned it somewhere and I missed it. Anyway, if you're listening, BBC and German production company that makes this show, which I believe is WRD, please make another series. I really, really enjoyed it. I want to see more. If you love ghost stories and you would like to support the channel, please do buy my book, Creepy Classics, available in paperback or ebook from Amazon, and subscribe to the channel for myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories, and weird and wonderful history in general. And until next time, bye! Hey Loki puppy! I haven't taught you any tricks yet. I need to teach you some tricks, but that's good sit. Good sit. Good sit. Good sit. Good sit. Good boy.